Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And this episode is special to me in my heart. As you all know, I was recruited into the Moon cult in 1974, dropped out of college, quit my job, bowed with my head to the floor before pictures of Moon and his wife, the so-called true parents, bowed to the floor in person many times in leadership meetings, got deprogrammed, and anyone who's heard me before, I've interviewed many former members who've been raised in different authoritarian cults, but I have a very special guest with me today, Elgen Strait. And Elgen, I heard you being interviewed by Andrew Gold on the podcast and listened to your story. And I asked Andrew to introduce me to you. And I honestly didn't realize you had your own podcast called Falling Out, which I've since started listening to episodes. In particular, I just listened to 2 episodes with an member, Lima, a woman.
Actually, Limi.
Limi, thank you for the correction.
No worries.
I think Brazilian, in any case.
Yeah.
And there's so much I want to share with the public, so I'm very grateful. And I just want to introduce you, Elgen Strait, second generation member of the Moon cult. And based on hearing you do interviews, you have no problem with using that term, right?
No, I don't. I think, I don't like the term ex-Moonie, particularly for me, because I never chose to become a Moonie to begin with. But in terms of ex second generation, but we sort of get lumped together into this greater ex-Moonie community, which is fine, just semantically to
I think it's a very valid point, and I stand corrected. And I think I should have introduced you as someone whose parents joined the Moonies cult, and they were in an arranged marriage,
Yes.
and you were progeny, supposedly sinless, that were going to
Yes.
populate the world and get rid of satanic evil lineages everywhere.
Yes.
And it's safe to say you've said, no, I don't believe this crap anymore.
I have said no. It took me many years, decades, but yeah, I'm firmly out. And I have to say, your reputation has preceded you in many ways in my life. I remember being, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years old in the 80s, and hearing your name.
Whoa, that's a long time ago.
And my parents were basically saying you were, influenced by the devil, doing the work of Satan, these sort of things. You were like the boogeyman, basically, when I was growing up.
Yeah, so I left in 76 and I went public, and then of course they thought I was brainwashed by the deprogrammers, try to get me back in, because I was held up by Moon as the model member, and they couldn't imagine that I would betray Father and the mission. But I was so horrified that I had believed all this fascistic, horrible right-wing stuff, and worried about all my family and friends. Not my family were traumatized, but my friends and all of my spiritual children and my spiritual grandchildren, people I had recruited in and who they recruited in, I wanted to get them out. I wanted to be like, you trusted me. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I manipulated you. I lied to you because they lied to me to get me in, and they convinced me that Satan's children dominate the world, so we have to lie to Satan's children to get them to God. That's twisted logic.
It's all very familiar to me. Yeah.
Right. But I do want to just add one more quick story. A former leader. So I was one of the top American leaders in the New York area where Moon moved to. And they moved the headquarters from DC to New York. And I was supposed to be the internal able to Neil Salonen, then president of the Unification Church of America, because Moon didn't think he was obedient enough, and Kamiyama wanted me to model for Neil to do whatever I was ordered to do without question.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I didn't know that. So I just a couple things spring to mind there. So first of all, the guy you mentioned, Neil Salonen, he's the guy who first greeted my mother when she went to her first Unification Church, like workshop setting, or her first visit to a church center. So if that guy had never done what he done, like, my life would have been completely different, basically. So anyway. Like,
so I'll tell you a quick Neil Salonen story from when I was in the cult, and I never, by the way, I went to 3-day workshops twice, and I never went to a 7, 21, 40, or 120. In fact, Kamiyama stood in front of Sun Myung Moon when all the American leadership was being sent to 120-day training, and he argued I was too important where I was, and Moon held out his hand over my head and said, "You just graduated 120-day training," which was pretty cool. I thought I was pretty special.
Instantly certified.
Yeah, and another time where I was literally, even though I was recruiting and lecturing, I was still sent out to fundraise and, to show my, break my ego and to be like all the members. Yep. And I'm in Manhattan under, the L's where the subways were, pouring rain. I'm having a box of chocolates, and this Lincoln Continental limousine rolls up, and I recognized it was Father and Mother. So I instantly ran to the car, and can you imagine? I'm bowing to this black Lincoln Continental. The window rolls down, and they're beaming. Moon and Hak Jahan are beaming at me, and I say, Mother, would you like chocolates or would you like mints?
Wow.
And they're like, give us the chocolates, and he handed me $20. But the big thing was the next morning, Sunday morning, there was always the gathering at Belvedere, and Moon said how everyone should be like Steve, ready for a blessing to come out of the blue, because Steve did the right thing at the right moment, and he held me up as the model member for Americans to follow. And it was like, validation from the greatest man in human history.
Yeah.
Fast forward to what you started saying about me being the demon. So when I got out, I started an ex-member group called Ex-Members Against Moon. And a former leader who got out later said that they had a leadership meeting about me because I was organizing the ex-members. And Moon called me the negative messiah because I was leading people straight to hell, was his words, is what the ex-leader was said about me. So and at the time, you have to understand, like, I was freaked out that I was going up against this wealthy, powerful, politically connected cult. I thought I would be assassinated at any moment. In fact, when I was protesting the matching at Madison Square Gardens, one of the Japanese leaders went like this to me.
Oh, wow.
And I tried to go talk to people who I used to hang out with, and they would like, running to the other side of the road and things like that. So I was very aware that I was like persona non grata.
Yeah, you were. You mean that was definitely evident. Like you were talked about. And I've actually had, so we can talk more about my podcast in a second, but I've had guests on my show who are, other second generation like me who, here, even now as adults, their parents, who are still in the cult, are of the impression that they are going to therapy with you, just because they're sort of negative against the church. And I'm certain the person I'm thinking of is not a client of yours in any way. But you're sort of, you are this,
say,
like,
even if they were.
Yeah, well, they told, but they told me that they'd never spoken to you, and yet their parents are convinced that somehow you're involved in their disillusionment with
like many other religious cults, Satan is more powerful than God, and anyone who's against the group is obviously Satan's agent. So
Yeah. I just want to ask a question about those early days.
Please ask
did
away.
Did you live in the New Yorker hotel?
No,
Okay.
so I was recruited at Queens College,
Okay.
lived in the Flushing Center, and the New York was split into 8 satellite centers.
All
And
right.
I was the first person to join the Flushing Center. I
Okay.
was then sent back to start CARP at Queens College. So I was founder of CARP at Queens College.
Yeah.
Later, I was assistant director at Flushing. Later, when they moved the headquarters from D.C. to 4 West 43rd Street, I was moved into 4 West 43rd Street.
Okay.
That's where I was supposed to correct Neil Salonen. And what I was told, and you'll appreciate this or not, but I think you will, was that Salonen actually had a meeting with Moon and complained that that parents were not able to spend enough time with their own children.
Oh.
And Moon said, if you want to open up a kindergarten and no longer be president, let me know.
Wow.
He literally asked Father Moon, and just like Moon said to my friend Alan Tate Wood, who was the top political American leader, Father, what do we do with the members who have a problem with homosexuality? And Moon said, tell them if it becomes a problem to cut it off, barbecue it, put it in a shoebox, and mail it to me.
Yeah.
And Alan later said, I knew I was leaving at that point. And he said, and then when we met on a TV show, when I first got out, he said, Steve, I left because people like you were being groomed to be little Nazis. And I said, I agree. I was.
Wow.
I would have done whatever I was ordered to do. I was
Yeah.
that indoctrinated.
Yeah. Wow. So shall I just kind of give the audience sort of a sense of like the arc of what it was like growing up there? And
That's my hope, exactly,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
people need to understand, folks like you, there are millions, not just of the
Yeah.
Moonies, but other cults coming out
Yeah.
going, I never had a normal childhood. I'm carrying all this baggage.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
please
absolutely.
share.
Yeah. So
Please.
I guess, yeah, and that's why, well, one reason I ask you about the New Yorker hotel is I guess like for me, that's where it all started. So uh, I was born in the early 80s and my family lived in the New Yorker hotel, which was at that point, was still owned by the Moons now, but it was kind of the epicenter in the 80s of sort of Mooney life on the East Coast.
So when I was in New York at 4 West 43rd, I was lecturing across the street from the library to get people to go to Barrytown for a weekend workshop.
Yeah.
The group had bought the New Yorker hotel, but it was
Okay.
just getting like cleaned and renovated. So
Yeah.
that was when I was in New York.
Yeah. So there were a lot of families living there in that hotel. They had a communal daycare there. They had and you mentioned the Belvedere Estate earlier. There was also a building up there called Jacob House, which I think you've been to.
Yes.
And that's
That's
a
where
place,
they had wheelchairs, Elgin, where people were going out pretending to be cripples and handicapped to fundraise. The
Okay.
wheelchairs were stored at J House. I remember.
Wow.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm interrupting
Wow.
you.
Yeah,
Keep
no,
going.
that's fine. But the reason I mention that is I think this is really important for the audience to understand is there was a time in the late 70s and early 80s where, so in 1975, Moon did a big mass wedding. My parents were part of that. And then, in the subsequent years, there was surprise, there was a baby boom. And Moon wanted to keep those parents continuing to work for him full time. And so to facilitate that, what he did was create a group childcare facility in this place called Jacob House, which is outside New York City. And kids were sent there at the age of 100 days to go and live there without their parents, so that their parents could go and either fundraise or gather new members for Moon. And that to me, there's something just so deeply wrong about that as the beginning of your life. And we talk about this on my show, and some of my guests were part of that. Fortunately, I was not subjected to that, but this is what's happening to these kids that are part of this, and that's just like the very, very beginning. I mean, so that's, when you're a toddler, and sometimes these kids wouldn't see their parents for years. Their parents would be out traveling for the church. Sometimes the parents would come back, the kids wouldn't even recognize them.
Yep.
That happened, and there were multiple facilities like this around the world. So that from infancy, you could be a part of this institutionalized system of neglect. From 100 days old, you could start there. Now, fortunately, I wasn't there, but I can also tell you, to give you a bit of context about what this was all like. My earliest memory is, I remember I was 4 years old, and my dad told me the story. We were reading an illustrated children's Bible. First story, the story of Adam and Eve. We read that, and he's like, okay, we read the story, and at the end of it, he's like, okay, we got to talk about this. This story got it wrong. And here's how it got it wrong. Number one, it wasn't actually a fruit that they were eating. It was Lucifer seducing Eve. So he told me what sex was at the age of 4, and then it was Eve seducing Adam, and that created created all of the suffering in human history. From those acts, and that's led us to where we are today. By the way, Elgen, you have one of the greatest gifts a human could ever receive, which is you are free of that blood lineage. You are free of that. You have no original sin. As part of that, it's also your job to make sure the lineage continues and to be a good soldier for Moon and his family, etc. That was at the age of 4, and that was like the very, very beginning of a life. In my entire childhood, being taught, shit like this. And you mentioned, excuse my language. You mentioned, Moon telling people to cut off their genitals. I remember being in speeches where he would say similar things. He would say, if you have any sexually impure thoughts, you should take scissors and cut your genitals. Speeches where he's telling women to pour concrete up their vaginas. This was part of like we would be in the room listening to these speeches. We would be reading those speeches in our living room as a family. That was like every week we were reading stuff like that. So yeah, I think you mentioned earlier sort of losing your childhood. That was part of the loss of the childhood. That's not the whole story, but this is kind of the backdrop of my life.
But I would just add that the reason to separate kids was to keep the commitment to him, not to allow the parental love and the bonding from the children to the parents, because Moon wanted allegiance to his army.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I agree. And so whilst I didn't experience that as an infant, particularly in the U.S., and it's not like this in all countries, but in the U.S., it would be possible for a kid to go through more or less their whole life in some sort of unification, their whole childhood, I should say, into early adulthood in some sort of Unification Church, so-called educational institution.
Mm-hmm.
So there are those nurseries. In the DC area, they have a, which is where I grew up for most of the time. They have an elementary school and a high school, so you could go to that school. It's not a live-in facility, but you would go there, every day learning the Mooney stuff. They also have a program, and I did this for a year. They have a program where you go to effectively indoctrination camp in Korea. So at the age of 13, I lived in a dormitory in Korea with about 100 kids. There were, I think, 4 dorm parents.
Yeah, the fatherland, right?
Correct. Yeah, the fatherland.
We all needed to learn Korean when the world, gets saved. We're getting rid of all languages and all religions, and it's only going to be Moonism and Korean.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I went there, I was in the 8th grade for me, and I basically, my education stopped for a year pretty much. so I could learn Korean language, Korean culture, and Unification Church indoctrination theology, effectively.
So did you actually like kimchi is my question.
I did. I grew to like it.
Okay.
I grew to like it.
I liked it in the group. It's a little too spicy for me since I've left, but
I have grown to like it.
It's pickled cabbage for people who don't know. It's a Korean. Yeah. It's not a Moonie thing. It's a Korean.
No, it's a Korean thing.
Yeah,
it's a Korean thing.
Yeah.
So I was, I was there. I came back. Thankfully, I went to a normal public high school, but it would have been possible for me to go either to a day school, a Moonie day school, or they also have live-in high school facilities as well on the East Coast in Connecticut. So I know people who were there in high school effectively. They bought the University of Bridgeport, so in theory it's possible to go to university.
Yeah, they don't have it anymore, I don't think.
Okay,
I think they sold it.
Okay.
But that was a big deal, and I have stories about that, but keep going.
But so fundamentally, I just want to paint this picture. Like it's possible for people to spend their whole life as part of this institution that places itself in the role of parent. And to your point, intentionally cuts those familial ties so that people have more allegiance to Moon, effectively.
Right. And so for the listeners, Moon was telling us, Steve, never be in a room alone with a sister. The guys slept on sleeping bags on the wooden floor, even in the wintertime, the women on another floor. But I was afraid of being molested by women my whole time there. And honestly, I will say this publicly, I never masturbated. I was 19 to 22, not a single time. I had 2 nocturnal emissions, and I had to repent and fast for 3 days and take cold shower conditions. But I really believed there were 10 generations of my mother's and father's ancestors looking at me at all times from the spirit world. And if I did anything wrong, they would be angry and they wouldn't be elevated and all that other crap.
Yep.
So,
I mean, we heard that. Like I heard that all my life. One of every day was like that, and I want to one thing that I remember hearing is like, if you ever fantasize about anyone, when you go to the spirit world, you're going to be connected to them. There's going to be these like black tentacles connecting you to anyone that you've ever fantasized about. So I think all that is all that is to like, if I could sum all of that up, it's an incredibly unhealthy environment when it comes to sex and relationships. And we didn't know any different. That was all we knew. It was coming from our parents from day one, effectively.
Yeah. And they also, members weren't told the truth about how many women Moon was having sex with, married before, kids out of wedlock. Just the hypocrisy was unbelievable. Nan Suk-hung wrote in The Shadow of the Moon. She was married to the eldest son of the latest wife, who confronted Moon, she said in her book and on 60 Minutes. And he said it was providential that I needed to have sex with these other women. And and in the meantime, because the people need to understand, this is a racist, purification, kind of white supremacy, except it's Korean supremacy, where we were going to be adopted into this holy lineage, so your parents would have sinless children and you would have sinless children, but only because they were sinless. And in the meantime, Nansuk saying, Hyoshin's going out with prostitutes, snorting cocaine, beating up members, kicking me in the stomach when I'm pregnant.
Yeah.
And that caused a lot of Americans to leave when she went public.
Well, so that book came out, I think, in 99. I think I was 18 at the time. And that book is actually what made me, basically made me leave. So at least initially, but I have to tell you, so basically when I was around 18, that book came out. And And it's funny you mentioned these providential affairs, because I remember the book came out, and my first reaction, because of everything I've been indoctrinated with, was he didn't do it. These are false allegations. These are haters, effectively. That was my first first instinct. But then I asked someone in the church, and to your point earlier, this is a white American guy who had a Korean wife, and the Korean wife is important because, to your point earlier, the Koreans were more in the know about what was happening than the non-Koreans. And so I asked him about these affairs, and I'll never forget. He's like, okay, you gotta understand. It's true, but here's why. And we had this long, I'll never forget, this incredibly long description of how terrible Moon must have felt when he was having sex with these women, because he was, it was so, that was all part of it, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. But when I heard that it was true, and I heard like the providential affairs, I was like, okay, so you're saying you can justify anything at that point. So there's no internal logic to any of this, and that's when I started to leave. But so I was 18 at the time. I was able to go to university. A lot of people who come out of this environment don't go to university. Their parents aren't supportive of it. Educational neglect is a big theme amongst my cohort. But fortunately, I went to university. Still, after university, because of all of the pressure within the organization to marry someone from the group, I decided, like, if I could make this work, then maybe that would be the best for everyone. So I accepted an arranged marriage at the age of 22. I was engaged at 22, and then I got married when I was 24. And yeah, that's due to the immense pressure, familial pressure, to.
So were you married to a Japanese woman or a Korean woman? Or?
No, I wasn't. She's half Brazilian, half English. And that's what brought me over here to England. So I live in London now.
I see. So were your parents able to say who you could match, or was this a Moon?
Yeah, so this was, my parents basically suggested it.
Yeah. Okay.
It was, so Moon didn't,
because they didn't do that when I was in. It was unless you were a top leader, then you could be like whisper these two and these two. And honestly, I saw things as a leader that, members have no clue about, like leaders sitting around with index cards of members and like trading them like baseball cards. Do you need a team captain in your region? I could trade you two sisters who are good fundraisers for a good it was like, whoa, crazy.
Wow.
Really crazy. But I want to come back to not only the neglect and the not having access to the parents, but the lack of education, I believe, about science, mathematics, history. Say some more about what you now know that you didn't know, what you should have known.
So I have to say I'm fortunate in that regard, because I was on a track in the public school system that was like focused on math, science, computer science, effectively. So I actually learned a lot of that. But I have to say, I actually wanted to become an engineer. And I learned this the hard way. To become an engineer, you have to do a lot of calculus. And that year that I was in Korea is the year that I was meant to be learning algebra. And I never learned algebra. And then when I came back, I started getting into higher order maths and getting into calculus, and I just didn't have the chops to do the calculus. And that actually like kind of ended my aspirations of being an engineer, just because didn't have the background, and I couldn't really make it up.
Interesting. What do you do now,
So,
may I ask, Elgen?
I work in sales in the tech industry. So I'm doing all right. It's not engineering, but I'm doing okay. But I guess I think the whole educational neglect is not something that I was that aware of personally until I started doing my podcast. So my podcast is fundamentally me interviewing other people who grew up in the same cult.
Yep.
And I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But
no, tell us some stories.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll tell you some stories, but I also want to set the scene for why I started it. So
right.
I guess so I had the arranged marriage in 2005. Moved to England. We were together until about 2018, and that's when we split up. So I'm now divorced, and something about going through the divorce, I feel like that's when I left the Unification Church for the second time, because so my ex-wife was the same as me. She was like, I don't believe in this, but if we can make this marriage work, great. So she wasn't particularly religious, but at the end of the day, that religion was a remnant of the cult's control over me. And so then when that marriage ended, then I felt like I could kind of really examine my life and try to understand what had happened to me. And so I started reading books, going to courses, and just trying to understand cults and what was happening, or sorry, what had happened to me. And as part of that, I guess a few things happened. Number one, my feel is that the cult recovery industry, if you want to call it that, I don't know if it's big enough to call it an industry.
I wouldn't. I'd like it to be an industry where people can get real help.
Yeah, but most of the resources that exist within it, not all, but most of them, are aimed at people. They're aimed at people who have loved ones who have been sucked into a cult on their own, or someone who's joined a cult and then left. There's very little that's aimed directly at people who grew up within these environments. And I felt I could do something to address that. And I also felt that if you put that to the side, if I think about everything that we went through as kids, there's so much shame and guilt built into that experience. And that only serves to give the organization greater control effectively. And the one thing that you can do to help remove that control is just talk about what happened. It's like the one thing that can be really damaging to them is just talking about what happened. And so I guess those thoughts were going through my head. And I also realized I had a conversation with a few different people who had grown up in the cult like me. They'd all left, but they'd all left for different reasons. And I thought, well, wow, how powerful might it be if you would just collect the stories of why people left. And podcasting was sort of the perfect medium to do that. So
it's great. If I got to tell you, it's kind of mind blowing for me to talk to you. And as you're talking, like neurons that I haven't accessed for 8 years are coming back. But part of the indoctrination is to never say anything bad about the leader, the doctrine, the policy. And it's called multiplication of evil. Like if you say something, and it's, of course, I call it information control under the BITE model.
Yeah.
But you have so much phobia stuff programmed in you not to talk about anything that you're critical about, that it's so healing to go, I'm going to do it anyway. And then you do it.
Yeah.
And somebody listens to you and gives you feedback, and it just takes out all that crap phobia stuff. And I'll just add that psychiatrist Judy Herman wrote a great book called Trauma and Recovery. And she said the best thing trauma survivors can do is tell their story and be believed. It's like the number one healing thing is not to feel alone. It's not me. I'm not stupid. I'm not possessed by demons. Have real thoughts and real feelings and real experiences. And then you can compare notes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, honestly, the feedback that I've gotten from the show has been amazing. It's great, it's incredible. I mean, so
Falling Out, people. If you want to check out Elgen's great contributions and work and just hear more. And I might add, it might help people coming out of the Jehovah's Witnesses, Children of God, the Krishnas to hear, because that's another healing thing, is to realize, oh my God, it was a totally different group. But it's the same issues that we're all dealing with.
Yeah, and I've heard I can't say for certain, but I actually think I have more listeners now who didn't grow up in the Moonies or who have no connection to the Moonies than who actually grew up in the Moonies. Although it's hard to say for sure, but I get a lot of feedback from people who came from other groups who say, look, this is really healing for me to hear. Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of blown away within a week of launching the show, which started about 2 years ago. I learned of 3 people who had left the cult just as a result of listening to the first 6 episodes or something like that. So,
yep.
Great. It's fantastic. I'm just going to keep doing this. It's working.
Yeah, we got to try to find Nansuk and get
I would love to speak with her.
Last I heard, she was in Massachusetts, and I interacted with her decades ago when her book came out, but I haven't followed up. And I think there was some type of financial arrangement for taking care of the kids where she stopped being public. So I don't know if she's got a hush thing forever, or it was just till the kids turn 21 or whatever.
Okay.
But I definitely recommend reading In the Shadow of the Moons, or go on YouTube and look up Nansuk Hong, Hong, on 60 Minutes. Chris Wallace interviewed her. It was a great episode. So talk about trafficking, labor trafficking, and
yeah. So it's interesting. I hadn't even heard the term labor trafficking until I started my podcast, and that's when I understood. That's what happened. That's what happened to us. And that's what happened to you. Yeah, exactly. That's what happened to my parents.
3 to 4 hours a night of sleep and 7 days a week and no pay and no vacation. Yeah. I think so.
Yeah, actually, so there's implications here specifically for the second generation. So, and I think I would love for more people to be aware of this. So, the part of we talked about the educational institutions that one could be a part of. Another part that you're meant to do is this thing called Special Task Force. Also, the acronym is STF. And that's basically, it's mobile fundraising. It's kind of what you were doing. You're going out in vans,
lying
selling trinkets,
to people to get
lying
money.
to people, selling trinkets on the side of the road.
Yep.
All this sort of stuff. And so kids, once they graduate high school, they're encouraged to basically do that full time for 1, 2, sometimes 3 years. And these are dangerous conditions. And I think it was in 2001, an 18-year-old woman was raped and murdered on one of these fundraising runs. We talk about that on my show. I actually just did an interview with someone a few days ago that hasn't aired yet. Someone who, thankfully, that didn't happen to her, but it was quite clear that the guy who was inviting her into her house did not have her best intentions at heart. And this is an organization who claims that, these so-called blessed children are so pure and so perfect, and we need to do everything to protect them. And yet the organization is sending them out into harm's way where they're getting raped and murdered.
Yeah, as if they need the money too.
Yeah.
It's like they got billions of dollars, but they still...
Yeah.
But they want that cash that can't be traced. Also.
Part of the indoctrination is, especially as a kid growing up in it, but probably the same for you, is the sort of spiritual blessings that you receive are directly proportional to the amount of money that you fundraise.
Yeah, the so-called spiritual blessings. Ha ha, ho ho.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that is, and it's still happening to this day. It was happening during COVID. I found that out
Yeah.
while doing my show. They were sending kids out during the COVID pandemic. Um, so yeah, it's happening. It's happening
So
to this
talk
day.
to me about Sean and Justin Moon. Have any thoughts about the Rod of Iron Ministry and the
Yeah,
Gun Factory? These are elder sons of Moon and
yeah.
Jahan. Go on.
So yeah, I remember meeting Sean at a workshop that we did. So okay, another part of the indoctrination is going to these really long summer workshops, which are kind of, you're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, you're doing 8 hours of lectures a day about the moon theology, blah blah blah. Anyway, I remember I think I was like 14 or 15 years old. I went to one of those, and Sean Moon, the gun cult guy, he's around my age, and he was at that camp, which was a big deal to have one of the so-called true children at the camp. And actually him and his brother, I think his name was Philip, the one who committed suicide in Vegas.
Jumped out of a hotel window.
Yes. Yeah. So Sean was there, and even as a teenager, he was, I'm sorry, I have to curse, but he was such an asshole as a teenager. He was unbelievable. Beating up kids, just really awful. And his brother, the guy who killed himself, was a really lovely as a kid. Like, they were polar opposites in terms of
and Hyojin was like that too. Hyojin was a total a-hole.
Yeah.
And he's the one who died prematurely from all the cocaine and everything else. He was very abusive and controlling. And it's the opposite of what should be with a spiritual person, which is humility and compassion and kindness and love. This was bullying, elitism, hatred, just disgusting.
Yeah. Sean is a bully. At the end of the day, he's a bully. I saw that firsthand. And he had very little. Oh, he had no compassion for the kids around him. I remember in that camp that I went to, there was one of the older so-called blessed children was giving sort of like a heart-to-heart to the kids and kind of being like, hey, it's not that big a deal if, like, sometimes you're interested in girls or boys. It's like, it's not that big a deal. Give yourself a bit of slack, was sort of what this guy was saying. And in the middle of speech, in front of like a couple hundred kids, a 15-year-old Sean Moon just gets up and starts screaming at this guy. And to his credit, the other guy held his own and held his ground in this altercation effectively. If this person is listening, they know who they are. They have my eternal respect and gratitude for putting unusual. Sean Moon in his place. Yeah, it's unusual,
but very cool. I have to share a quick Hyojin story from Belvedere. Just, forgive me, but after Moon would speak in the morning on Sunday, there would often be like gatherings. The members would have the day off. They'd bring in food, whatever. And I was playing softball with some of the blessed children and some of the other kids. I was pitching to Hyojin.
Okay.
And I tried to make it as soft and easy as possible, right?
Yep,
he swung and he missed. Another one, swung and he missed. I threw another one, swung and he missed. And then I was like looking around at everybody. I think it's 3 strikes. He's like, hits the bat to the floor. Pitch it again. And I, of course, had to obey the holy, child of the Messiah. So I pitched it again. He swung and he missed. He threw the bat down. He said, "Game over." And we all had to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. Right. Yeah. I mean, they're spoiled billionaires' kids.
Exactly. The opposite of what we would think a real spiritual person should be and have these kids. Forgive me, I shared way more than I meant to in this. I
It's
really
okay.
want to give you more time. I'm looking at the clock,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we have about 15 more minutes. So I really
Yep.
want to
Yep.
invite you to share what you want our
Yeah.
listeners to know.
I guess, well, if I think about sort of the if I think about everything that we went through, first of all, it's a devastating environment for a lot of reasons. I mean, suicide and suicidal ideations are very common. Depression is very common. The environment that we've spoken about, first of all, it is an environment of sexual abuse on its own. It creates an environment where sexual predators are allowed to thrive in some cases. Unfortunately, it also sets people up for further sexual abuse later in their life. I've spoken particularly with the women who basically say they've been in situations where they didn't know they could say no because they were taught that they couldn't.
Well, men are subject and women are objects in the Moonies
Yeah.
divine principle, by the way, listeners. So women, like many other cults, women have no rights, and
Yeah,
they have to do
exactly.
what they're told.
Exactly. Yeah. No, this is not unique to the Moonies,
Right.
but it's certainly part of what we experience. So I mean, this is a real, and this people have died. Kids have died doing these fundraising things. Kids have been neglected. Others have died from other sorts of neglect. This is not a harmless religion. It's not a harmless organization, and I personally I think it's. And you mentioned this earlier, like it's not just us, thousands of ex-Mooney kids. There's the the Mormon kids and the Scientologist kids
Right.
and the JW kids and blah 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 blah. There's millions of us, and I feel like we in general we're a byproduct of society's generally laissez-faire attitude towards religion that effectively excuses child abuse in the name of religious belief, and that's a fundamental. I just feel like that's something that society doesn't want to reckon with. We're a byproduct of that, and no one really wants to pick up that rock and look at it, quite honestly. And that's part of what my podcast is trying to do, is just kind of like scream like this is the reality that is being constructed for not just for us but for millions of others. And I just wish like society could somehow get it through its head that something needs to be done to stop religion being a shield for abuse.
Yeah, so I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second and just encourage you to listen to my interview with Marcy Hamilton, who's a law professor, CEO of Child USA. It's the only international think tank specifically aimed at making children no longer be property, but have actual rights. And she specifically wrote a book called God versus the Gavel, where she is taking on religion. And in fact, she's involved with 3 people raised in Scientology suing the cult for trafficking.
Okay.
So
that's
check
interesting.
her out.
Yeah. Okay. I think if anything's going to take this sort of stuff down, it's going to be through human trafficking, because I kind of, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it feels like a pretty clear-cut case.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely going to check her out. And there's something else that I want to mention
Please.
for your audience. I think this is really important. And I suspect this might have happened after you left the Moonies, but it's this... the advent of coerced adoptions within the Moonies.
Yeah.
So basically, and we talk about this on my show. I've had guests who went through this on their own lives. But basically, the Unification Church has this doctrine that only members who have been blessed by Reverend Moon can have these so-called sinless children.
Meaning married by Moon, not blessed.
Correct. Married.
That's loaded language. That's
correct. Sorry, excuse me. Yes, okay. Yes. Married by Moon. Only if they're married by Moon. Right. After that marriage, their kids are sinless.
Yeah.
That's step 1. Step 2 is to really experience the full love of God. you need to have a so-called blessed family. So blessed parents need a blessed child. Now this becomes problematic when parents are unable to conceive.
Right.
Because there's millions of other kids that they could adopt out there, but those kids don't have this pure blood lineage. So what that does is it creates demand within the organization for parents who are unable to conceive, or couples who are unable to conceive, for them to adopt the children of other parents who are able to conceive. First of all, this is encouraged by the organization. Women who give their kids away are considered heroes. Sometimes they're given cash prizes for doing that. And sometimes it's done under extreme duress. I've had multiple testimonies on my show where basically pregnant women are brought up on stage, and a church leader basically says, "You got to give your kids away." And so these poor women are up in front of hundreds of people. It's incredibly. There's a lot of pressure up on that stage, and they're coerced into giving their kids away.
Yeah.
This has been happening. I know many people who have undergone that, and it's of particular interest right now, I think, because of what's happening in Japan.
Yes.
With the Shinzo Abe assassination.
Yes.
So I'm actually one of the great unanticipated benefits of doing my podcast is that some of the people in Japan basically told me that by listening to the stories on my podcast about this practice, they were able to effectively influence the legal strategy of the activists in Japan, and now the activists in Japan are specifically targeting this practice that the Unification Church is still doing to this day.
Yeah.
So
Kudos to you.
Thank you. I mean, it's a particularly cruel practice, and I just think the world needs to know about it. And I think the other thing is, I mean, you look at what happened in Japan, the Abe assassination. Shinzo Abe is the tip of the iceberg of all of the political, VIP grift that is associated with the Unification Church. And personally, I would love for the amount of scrutiny that's being placed on those connections in Japan. I would love to see that spread.
Of course.
It's happening in the U.S. It's happening here in the U.K. It's happening in many, many countries, but no one is really applying that lens like they are in Japan.
Agreed.
And I would love for someone to do that. It's going to take multiple
Agreed.
people.
There were also getting lonely Japanese men promising them women to marry. And so there was like a sex trafficking piece.
Oh, yeah, I think I heard about this as well.
That needs to be exposed. But unfortunately, the Moonies have way too much political power in the United States, as I see it. So I'm doing everything that I can. But, the fact that Trump, Pence, Pompeo, Esper spoke for Hak Jahan, saying what a wonderful group this was and all of that crap. This was after the January 6th violent insurrection that Sean Moon was present for, saying it was Antifa. And as far as I know, there's been no prosecution, no media focused on the Moonies' involvement with January 6th, even though I've done everything I can to.
Yeah, no, I can tell you, so there are people on my show who have family members that are part of part of the Sean Moon subcult.
Yep.
But they were telling me about people they know taking part in the insurrection, effectively.
So I think we need to do a part 2. I think there's way more stories that we need to share and to share
I'd be up for that.
With our listeners. I can't leave without saying Moon had a child out of wedlock, gave it to Bohi Pak to raise, and Sammy Pak didn't even know that he was the illegitimate son.
Yeah, and some of the kids who are passed around internally don't know that they were that happened to them.
Yeah. So I check out Marcy Hamilton, and
Okay.
I think that
Thank you.
She's really gone so strongly into protecting children's rights and saying just because you have a IRS certification, you're a religion, doesn't mean you have the right to abuse people, especially children.
Yeah.
And it's so obvious, but people have
no one wants
blinders.
no one wants to look at that. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and the cults have done a good job. When I say good, I mean effective job of hiring scholars of religion, so-called sociologists, like Eileen Barker, who say, "Oh, the Moonies don't brainwash people. I know because I went to a workshop." And I said, Eileen, when we knew that there was a sociologist coming, we changed the workshop. Oh, they would never do that. That was in the UK. I'm like, are you kidding me? I was a leader. I know exactly what they were doing. The ends justify the means, Eileen. Yeah. Oh, no. She built her whole reputation.
She did, absolutely. I'll tell you one thing about her. My dad, so my dad used to run one of the front groups, the International Conference for the University of the Sciences. And Eileen Barker was one of his contacts, and so he was like friends with her. He would pay for her to fly to this conference here, that conference there, and they stayed in touch over the years. And it was obvious that like I think she had consumed a lot of Mooney dollars in travel and entertainment fees, effectively.
Yeah, and honorariums, and just she made her whole reputation on being an expert on cults, getting money from the UK government for Inform, which would basically just say there's no such thing as brainwashing, and you need to understand your adult child needs to have freedom to be themselves, missing the whole point of undue influence.
Yeah.
Right. So Elgen, my man, look forward to meeting you in person, but let's do another one. And,
okay, sounds good.
More stories.
Absolutely.
And there's got to be at least 75,000 ex-Moonies in America, from my calculations, that have not been public to say, oh yeah, I was in that, and I was told to break the law. I was told to steal. I was told to lie for God, etc. And especially the political machination stuff. My friend Mike Listman shook Richard Nixon's hand during the God wants Nixon to be president despite Watergate, so we should ignore the rules of law. And God says, because Moon says God says, and that was another version of what was happening with Trump in January. He said, well, God says Trump won, so therefore, and how do you know God said that? Oh, my apostle told me, because he gets direct revelations from God. Excuse me? Back to reality, people. Yeah. So thank you, my man, and
no worries. If I can just plug, if people want to find the show, so just look for Falling Out on all the podcast players. My website is fallingoutpod.com. Instagram Falling Out Pod, Twitter Falling Out Pod. You can find me.
Perfect. I'm really glad you said that, and I hope people will subscribe and like and give positive reviews and share your episodes. And encourage ex-members to contact Child USA and say, hey, we were abused in the Moonies. Can you please consider doing a trafficking suit for us or whatever? I think she'd be pretty up for it, honestly, because she's not gonna. If she takes on Scientology, she'll take on anybody, in my opinion.
She's aiming high there. So that's really good.
Pleasure. Have a great day, and thanks again.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. Talk to you soon. Cheers. Bye bye.